So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Feminist Writing. So we're looking at Judith Butler's text, Gender Trouble, and this will be the concluding lecture of that text. So in the previous lecture, we saw how Butler draws on Fredric Jameson and maps out the difference between parody and pastiche, and we saw how the Butler seems to prefer pastiche to a certain extent because pastiche reveals, according to Butler, that there was no ontological origin at any given point of time. Whereas parody retains an idea of origin, parody retains a knowledge of origin or an acknowledgement of origin, which is then derided and deconstructed. Pastiche does away with any acknowledgement of origin at any given point of time. So pastiche reveals any origin to be inauthentic, every origin to be a mimetic act. So therein lies the hyper-mimetic quality of pastiche, which Butler finds more compellingly radical at any given point of time. Now, we just take that argument, we take that analysis and see how that connects to her understanding of gender and how gender becomes, preferably, according to Butler, an act of pastiche, especially when it comes to the drag or the production of identity through the drag. And this is what she says, and this should be on the screen highlighted in yellow, where she's saying, gender is thus a construction that regularly conceals its genesis. The tacit collective agreement to perform, produce, and sustain discrete and polar genders as cultural fictions is obscured by the credibility of those productions and the punishments that attend not agreeing to believe in them. The construction compels our belief in its necessity and naturalness. The historical possibilities materialize to various corporeal styles are nothing other than those punitively regulated cultural fictions alternately embodied and deflected under duress. So, very, very loaded terms over here which are being used. And what is being said is that gender becomes, or at least mainstream gender or compulsory gender becomes an act of coercion, right? It becomes an act of conformity. You conform to certain things under coercion, under duress, as Butler is saying. That is, there are certain narratives which are grand in quality, certain narratives which are productive in quality, which are mainstream, which are hegemonic in quality, and gender becomes an entire anxiety to conform to those categories of mainstream production of meaning. So and of course, Butler says that there are punishments that attend to not agreeing to believe in them. So if you transgress those norms, if you transgress those gendered configurations of productions and meaning making process, then there are punishments, there are punitive quality which are meted out to you at any given point of time, and that punishment obviously is a punishment given for transgression. Okay, so it becomes obviously a cultural process, it becomes a cultural mechanism of regulation, of control, of coercion, of conformity, etc. And then, of course, there are the historical possibilities which are materialized through the various corporeal styles, and those are nothing other than those punitively regulated cultural fictions, alternately embodied out and deflected under duress. So there are cultural fictions, very, very important phrase. Those are fictions, which pass off as given, which pass off as universal categories, which pass off as aspirational categories, something which we want to aspire to, something which we want to conform to, because that's how they're projected and internalized to reputations. And of course, it's materialized through different corporeal styles. So again, corporeality is very much a discursive phenomenon, according to Butler. So the line between corporeality and discursivity is it's almost non-existent for Butler. And they are more or less the same thing. So your corporeal performance are discursive in quality, your discursive performance are corporeal in quality. So there's an axiomatic relationship between corporeality and discursivity that Butler is obviously mapping onto. And that's something which is sort of foregrounding, and that's foregrounded throughout her work, throughout her overall work, not just Gender Trouble, but also later works that she has produced, which are equally compelling and equally complex in quality. Okay, so these are cultural fictions alternately embodied, and deflected under duress. So they're sometimes embodied, they're sometimes deflected under coercion, under duress. So there's a compulsory performances which regulate our meaning-making mechanism through the body. So how do you corporealize meaning? How are meanings produced through corporeality is something that Butler is constantly reminding us. Okay, now if you take that into account and we continue defining gender as a performative process, This is what we get according to Butler. So gender ought not to be construed as a stable identity or a locus of agency from which various acts follow. So in other words, there is no centrifugal quality about gender. So being a bit physics away, mathematical away, it's about movement, etc. But what Butler is saying is there's no center from which gender performances emanate, right? It's not really centrifugal, rather it's centripetal. So that origin, that center, is created by the different activities around it, right? So that's what she's saying over here. So gender ought not to be construed as a stable identity or locus of agency from which various acts follow. So there's no point from which various acts follow. Rather, gender is an identity tenuously constituted in time. So it's a temporal identity, something which is produced at any given point of time. It's very local in quality, instituted in an exterior space through a stylized repetition of acts. And that's a very, very important phrase. So gender is a stylized performance. As a performance which is repeated, it's a stylized repetition of acts. So certain repetitions take place through a very extensive process of stylization. So the effect of gender is produced through the stylization of the body, and hence must be understood as the mundane way in which bodily gestures, movements, and styles of various kinds constitute the illusion of an abiding gendered self, right? So, different activities, gestures, movements, they constitute an illusion of the abiding gendered self. So the gendered self becomes a very important category. But then, of course, the gender self becomes the function of those activities. It's not as if the self predates or precedes the activities. The activities produce a self, and rather, it's the other way around. So it's more centripetal in quality. It's movement towards the center, which is created by the movement in the first place, right? So it's not really a point from which different functions emanate. The point itself is a function of those functions, in a way. And therein lies the hypermimetic quality of gender. So it's a stylized repetition of acts. So every act is stylized, and it is repeated over and over again. Now, what Butler also says that norm of gender, that ideal of gender, which is obviously desired and coveted and institutionalized by mainstream mechanisms of meaning, it can never really fully be appropriated. So there's always a gap between the ideal act of gender, which is obviously discursively produced and maintained and promoted, and what is really the case, what is really the embodied reality of gender. So that gap is always there between the ideal condition and a real embodied condition. And that gap, sometimes it can be subversive in quality, sometimes it can produce anxiety, sometimes it can produce transgression. So that gap is important for us to understand. And that's what Butler is saying over here. The gender is also a norm that can never be fully internalized. The internal is a surface signification, and gender norms are finally phantasmatic, impossible to embody. So there's a phantasmatic quality about gender. So gender norms are fantastic in quality in the sense that, it's actually a fantasy which cannot be internalized, which cannot be embodied in reality, right? So that fantasy of gender, the fantasy of ideal gender, is something which can only be, imagined, but not embodied at any given point of time. Now, if the ground of gender identity is a stylized repetition of acts through time and not a seemingly seamless identity, then a spatial metaphor of the ground will be displaced and revealed as a stylized configuration. Indeed, a gendered corporealization of time. This is a magnificent phrase that Butler is offering us, a gendered corporealization of time. So time becomes corporealized. So gender becomes a spatio-temporal activity. Gender becomes a spatio-temporal act of production. It occupies, it inhabits one spatio-temporal frame, one spatio-temporal spot, which is corporealized, right? So the corporealization of time is what Butler is offering us. So, you embody time, you embody a given point of time, and that given point of time, that embodiment of that given point of time produces an identity for that moment of time, which is hardly universal, which is hardly extended or extendable to other points of time. So every act of activity production, every act of identity production, is a spatio-temporal function, and every act of identity production, it entails a corporealization of time. It entails a possession of time to the body, and therein lies the corporealization metaphor that Butler is using. And it's a magnificent metaphor, I think. It's something which is obviously summing up what she's saying quite compellingly. So the abiding gendered self will then be shown to be structured by repeated acts that seek to approximate the ideal of a substantial ground of identity, right? So that act of repetition is also an act of approximation. It will seek to approximate or aspire to approximate the ideal of a substantial ground of identity, but which in the occasional discontinuity reveal the temporal and contingent groundlessness of this ground, right? So it's a very, by this time we should be able to understand what Butler is saying quite clearly, that there are certain moments of discontinuity, there are certain moments of interruption, sometimes deliberate discontinuity, sometimes deliberate interruptions. Now what those interruptions do quite compellingly, what those discontinuities do quite compellingly, is that they reveal the temporal and contingent groundlessness of the ground. So there's no ground actually. So it's that a very Derridean thing. The center is not in the center, right? So that's what Derrida says, and this again very Butler is drawing that post-structuralist rhetoric and vocabulary quite compellingly, where she's saying that the whole idea of ground, the one ground from which gender is produced, that itself is a fantasy. And how do you know it's a fantasy? We know it's a fantasy when certain interruptions take place in the activity of medium production, when certain interruptions take place, either accidentally or deliberately or surreptitiously, if certain discontinuities take place, only then we have a moment of pause, we have a moment of liminality through which we can look at the fact that there's actually no ground, it's complete groundlessness. And the whole idea of having a ground from which gender is produced, from which gendered identities are produced, is actually a fantasy, is actually a phantasmatic quality. And that phantasmatic quality, that groundlessness of the ground, is something that Butler is highlighting quite compellingly. And obviously, as I mentioned, this is a complete drawing on the Derridean vocabulary, the post-structuralist vocabulary, the deconstructionist vocabulary that Butler is using and weaving into her analysis of gender. And that is what makes Gender Trouble such a complex and seminal book. It's one of those texts which we keep going back to any study of gender, that post-structuralist take on gender as performance, performativity, and the whole idea of discontinuity, the occasional discontinuity, is such a beautiful phrase, the occasional discontinuity, which again is very temporal in quality. It's occasional, it's temporary in quality. That discontinuity will come, stay, and go away. But when it stays, when it's there as a liminal presence, they have the insight, the epiphany into the fact that the whole idea of gender, the whole ground of gender is actually groundless in quality. It's actually a fantasy, a phantasmic production, right? There is actually no ground, there's actually no center. So center is an illusion which is created by different activities. So once activities stop or discontinue or interrupted, only then you realize there's actually no center, right? And that's something which Butler is telling you. And the point is, we need to take the not just the message that Butler has given us or the theory that Butler has given us, but also the attitude of Butler. Butler wouldn't see it, or any postmodernist wouldn't see it, as necessarily a bad condition, as necessarily a condition of lack or absence. But that can actually be a condition of possibilities of meaning, where you realize there's no ground, where you realize there is no center. That can actually produce more meaning, that can actually produce alternative meanings, or subversive meanings. And those acts of subversion can only be possible through these acts of interruptions and discontinuities that Butler is highlighting quite dramatically and compellingly. Okay, so we are almost done with Gender Trouble, and so the last bit the Butler is saying the distinction between expression and performativeness is crucial. So there's a massive difference the Butler is trying to map out between expression and performativeness. So if gender attributes and acts, the various ways in which a body shows or produces its cultural signification are performative, then there is no pre-existing identity by which an attribute might be measured. There would be no true or false, real or distorted acts of gender, and the postulation of a true gender identity would be revealed as a regulatory fiction. And that's a very important phrase, regulatory fiction. It's a fiction which is meant to regulate certain gender activities, to allow or disallow certain gender activities. And that will be revealed. So the regulatory quality will be revealed. How will that be revealed? Once we realize that the whole act of identity production, it is what produces the cause. So there's no pre-existing identity by which an act is produced or measured or calibrated, right? So those activities itself produce the self. The activities itself produce the identity. And once we realize it, once we acknowledge and articulate it, in cultural discourses, we realize that any idea of gender, any postulation of a true gender identity or normative gender identity is actually a regulatory fiction. So that revelation would appear that it's actually a regulatory mechanism through which a certain kind of grand narrative is maintained and consolidated and protected and promoted. It's actually a fiction, it's actually an illusion, which is a regulatory inequality. So once that realization happens, then obviously the next natural step is subversion and questioning the whole production of gender as a fiction, as a regulatory fiction. So that concludes Gender Trouble. I'm sure you'll agree it's a phenomenal work, not just in gender studies, not just in feminism, but also as part of how we consume culture. And the whole idea of gender becomes, according to Butler, an act of consumption. We consume gender or gendered performances unquestioningly. So those temporary disunities are very, very important, because those temporary disunities reveal to us, or occasional discontinuity is a beautiful phrase, I can't get over it. The occasional discontinuity will reveal to us that the whole idea of gender production and gender consumption is actually an illusion, right? So we are consuming something which is given to us through a very reified process, reified, commodified process. So gender becomes a reified act, gender becomes a commodified quality. It's something of a commodity which is internalized and repeated ad infinitum. But when we have the occasional discontinuity, only then we realize that this is actually a commodity, and the whole act of gender becomes a construction. And that liminal moment, that liminal spatio-temporal point where you realize that the space of gender, it doesn't exist. There's no ground, actually, it's completely groundless. You also realize the time of gender, the corporealization of gender is also a performative act. And once you realize that, you realize that the entire normative quality of gender is a regulatory fiction. So normativity becomes a regulatory fiction, normativity becomes a compulsory regulatory fiction, according to Butler. So again, we see how postmodernist this is, how post-structuralist this is in the idea of looking at gender through these lenses. So with that, we conclude Gender Trouble. I hope you enjoyed reading the text as much as I did talking about it. And from this point, we move on to the last two texts in this course, which will be Geeta Hariharan's Remains of the Feast and Jhumpa Lahiri's A Temporary Matter. But with that, we conclude Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. So I'll see you in the next lecture with a different text. Thank you for your attention.